Alden's book, The Outlander, to me. And the story focuses on a young woman, Claire Randall, who, while holidaying in Scotland, visits this Stonehenge-like site at Craignadoon, known for its connection with the old religious ways and some strange goings-on. And on Claire's second visit to Craignadoon, an eerie wind picked up. And in some strange way, she was transported back 200 years in time, back to just before the coming of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And within moments, she was accosted by a captain in the British Army. She would have been gravely abused by him, except for the intervention of a band of Scots who decided to keep her in their company for safekeeping. I'm telling you this story, not to recommend the book per se, but the Scots, when they had Claire in their company, they had a word for her. And the word was Sassenach. Sassenach. It's a word that I hadn't encountered in years. I'd almost forgotten it. But Sassenach originated in the Highlands of Scotland. And it was their Gaelic word for the lowland English people. And after a while, it just came to denote all English people. And the Scots and the English, they don't get along that well, as we continue to find out with talk of separation. And anyway, this word, Sassenach, and it meant you were English, you were an outsider, you were an outlander. There's a veteran British actor named Maurice Reeves, and he has this thick Scottish accent from Glasgow. And with the accent, you would assume that he's from Glasgow, but he actually was born in Sunderland, in the northeast part of England. And he tells this story about how when his family first moved to Glasgow, that he went to school, and he says that the local lads used to give him a really tough time because he was different. He had this Northeast England accent. It's called a Geordie accent. He was a Geordie, and they used to make fun of him, and he became a target for the other boys. They were saying, Sassenach, Sassenach, outsider, you're not one of us. And he says they were picking fights with him and beating him up, and he said it became incredibly important for him to learn to speak with a Glaswegian accent very quickly, so that he could fit in and just be one of the gang. Well, it's never easy for anyone to be a Sassenach, wherever you are. I suppose I'm a Sassenach in Belleville. But if we take the King James version of that passage that was just read for us, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, Peter suggests that Christians are like Sassenachs in the world. They're like outlanders, outsiders. And the King James Version in verse 9 calls Christians a peculiar people. A peculiar people. Now, I'm not sure that's a word that we should all aspire to. Like, who wants to be odd? But most of us, we want to fit in and be one of the gang, but you think about it for a moment. Who is it that rises early on a Sunday morning, gets cleaned up, puts on sometimes a suit or something nice, and goes into a building and sings songs in the midst of a group of people out loud, and Like, have you ever been to the Air Canada Centre or the Rogers Centre or that place up in Ottawa? I've forgotten what it's called. Used to be the Corral Centre when I lived in Ottawa. So they try in these places to get people to sing the national anthem at the beginning of a game. Now, unless it's a playoff game in which the team is playing against some dastardly American team, people don't sing the national anthem. They sort of hum and whisper it. And, you know, the national anthem comes on, you've got someone in the front leading it, and people are there. "O Canada, our home." Like, people don't sing out. Like this other group I was mentioning a little earlier, they just don't. And if you do, you're odd. So there was one time, my daughter and I were at a Blue Jays game, and the national anthem comes on, and people are singing away. And there's this guy standing beside us, like right next to me, and he's, "Oh, Canada!" My daughter leans over to me and she says, "Awkward." People don't sing out, but this group that gets up on Sunday mornings, they come into a building and they sing, and they seem to enjoy it, and they have choirs to help them sing, and sometimes praise teams wherever they are. And this group, they sit quietly most of the time and listen to some sort of somewhat trained half-wit go on about God. And, Dan, it's not funny. And then, they'll listen for 15 or 20 minutes, or 45 in some churches. And then they'll bow their heads and they pray to a God who's unseen. And many people in our society, that's not their way. They go to the cottage, they go skiing, they sleep off their Saturday nights. And speaking of Saturday nights, this other group, on Saturday night, they can broadly behave themselves, maybe not as completely raucous as others, and they will talk from time to time about virtue and love and being kind to others and morality and even holiness sometimes. And when you think about it, these people are peculiar to the world. These people known as Christians. Not quite the same. And to many, I think they're like Sassenachs, outsiders. And that's one of Peter's main themes in this letter. If we go back to the beginning, he talks about a magnificent thing that God did in raising Christ from the dead. And he encourages people to place all of their hope on the grace of God that is coming with Christ's return. And there have been a lot of preachers in the last generation or two who will talk about the grace of God and then they'll leave it at that, but not Peter. Peter goes on and he says this grace transforms people and transforms their character. It's as though the person who experiences the grace of God is reborn or transformed. And it's this that he thinks makes Christians Sassenachs in the world. Different. And he uses words in that like exile and foreigner and refugee, depending on what translation you look at. They're like refugees in the world. Because when they're reborn, they no longer engage in malice or guile or insincerity or envy. Ungodliness is gone. They become a people of honor, almost like God. Almost like God who is love. They express love to one another. And others may be more interested in abuse and causing suffering. The Christian, like Jesus, responds with love. And it's such a such a radical way that the followers of Christ are like Sassenachs, peculiar. Now, Peter uses another metaphor to sort of describe how this change takes place. And he says, like newborn babes, crave pure spiritual milk, so that you may grow in salvation. And it's just like the Christians, the people who follow Christ, they have a change of diet. You've maybe heard about the great Serbian tennis player, Novak Djokovic. In the early part of the 2000s, in the middle of the 2000s, Djokovic was a great player, but he just couldn't get over the top with it. And he had these mid-game collapses. He'd begin games strongly only to fade away. And he knew he could beat some of these better players in the world, but he just couldn't get there. His body wouldn't let them. And in 2010, it came to light that Djokovic had a little problem with gluten and with some dairy products. And so he was advised to cut out anything with gluten and dairy products. And so he was asked to do a 2-week trial. And, you know, with that, you have to give up breads and anything with flour, pasta, pizza, breaded or battered fish or whatever. And it was particularly difficult for Djokovic because his dad owned a pizza shop. But change he did, and he tried it for a couple of weeks, and the change was so noticeable that he went on. And within a year, by 2011, he went on, he won a couple of the big ones, and he became ranked number 1 in the world, and he has been there for most of the last 5 years, just lacking a little bit this year with Andy Murray. Another Scot. This seems to have a Scottish theme, this service. But powered his way to number 1 ranking because he changed a diet. And a change in diet can make a remarkable difference. Peter's sort of suggesting that for the Christian. Change your diet. Crave pure spiritual milk. And if you study the passage, the link is with the Word of Christ. Crave the Word of Christ. You know, we're all very much products of our culture and our environments and what we take into our hearts and our souls and our minds. If I can illustrate that for a moment. As a young fellow, I had been in Canada for about 7 years, and I had this erroneous thought that Americans were very similar to Canadians. Until I went to live in Kentucky for 3 years in Lexington and found out that, they're quite different. And after initial excitement about this different culture, I began to query a little bit what I was being fed in American newscasts, and it was their Memorial Day coverage that finally got me. You would have thought that only Americans fought in the Second World War. Nobody else. And having grown up in Britain and spent some years in Canada, I knew otherwise. And I felt, therefore, that I needed a bit more balanced news. So I went out and I bought this little tiny shortwave radio. Remember those? And I listened pretty well every night to BBC World Service, a little bit of news there, or CBC International, a little bit of news there. And I thought that through that, I was getting more balance. I suppose it meant that I, too, was a product of my upbringing and my own experience. But to put it bluntly, we get very influenced by where we are and what we hear and what we take in. So if you take in CBC every day and all the time, you're going to be thinking along certain lines. If you listen to PBS And in the United States, you're going to be thinking along certain lines, which will be a little different, but have some similarities. If you get your news through Fox News, or if you get it through Facebook and the fake news posts and conspiracy theories that would fool even the elite on Facebook, then you're going to be thinking in a completely different way. And it seems that we are what we eat, in a sense. We are what we eat. And this is why this pure spiritual milk is so important. It's lined up in the text with the Word of Christ. And this Word of Christ makes such a difference in people's lives. And if we don't allow ourselves to be influenced by that, even a little bit, in our daily routines, we're going to wind up just like our general culture, whatever it is. But when we have this pure spiritual milk, it's different. And Peter says it helps us grow up in salvation. It takes the grace of God and moves us along and helps us to grow. And that's when the Christian life can become effective and real. I think we saw this about 10 years ago. You probably remember. There was a man by the name of Charles Roberts who rocked a small community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. On a certain morning in October, he went out, took his kids to the school bus, called them back, and told them one last time that he loved them. An hour later, he loaded up his truck with tools and with weapons, and he drove a very short distance down to the one-room schoolhouse, which was a different school than his children went to. It was one that the Amish children went to in Nickel Mines. And when he entered that schoolhouse, he told all the boys to leave, and he lined the girls all up at the blackboard, and he tied their legs together with wire. And before the police could do anything, he shot all 11, killing 5. And then he turned the gun on himself. Nickel Mines school shooting was terrible, a tragedy for the Amish community. And many of those families lost loved ones and had other loved ones in hospital that day. But you know, in spite of their own personal losses, do you remember what they did? A number of them walked the short distance to the Roberts home, and they went up and talked to the father of Robert's wife, and they extended their love and their concern and their forgiveness to the family. At Robert's funeral a few days later, they went along, and they went so far as to line up in a certain way to protect the Roberts family from the press and the media, that they couldn't be snapping pictures of them in their grief. And they allowed the Roberts family some privacy. But not only that, when a collection was gathered by the American people for the bereaved families, the Amish people insisted that it not only go to the families of those who had lost children, but also in equal portion to the family of the perpetrator, family that was grieving in another way. There's a recent interview in which Marie Roberts was asked how she and the children had got through their own struggles, and she said, the Amish people took my breath away. And she said it wasn't through evil or retribution, it was with their love and forgiveness. And she said that had been an important part in her ability to get beyond what had happened. And that had been a big part in how her children had managed. And you know, it must have been an incredibly difficult time for the Amish people. It's a peculiar response, because most others would have thought about retribution. But perhaps it was the right response, because for Marie Roberts it was a gift, a great, great gift. And we don't learn that kind of response from Fox News or CBC, but we do learn it from the pure spiritual milk of Christ's Word. And Peter says, the people who have experienced the grace of God are rid of things like malice and guile. They grow up in salvation. They follow the footsteps of Christ, who, when he was abused, didn't return it. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but he entrusted all things to the one who judges justly. Seems to me that the Amish people had spent some time with Christ. And that's our call too, to spend time with Christ. And hopefully we won't encounter some of the things that the Amish people encountered. But in whatever comes across our paths, we're called to respond, and respond with peace and love. Peculiar, but we're called to respond with peace and love. And Peter says it's as though we're outlanders, foreigners in the midst of the world.